Installation issues. In this nugget, we're going to continue our discussion of installation issues. We'll start off by looking at how to set up and perform an installation over the network. Then we'll look at Kickstart, which is a Red Hat tool to automate the install process. And we'll wrap up by talking about the bootloaders Grub and Lilo. So let's get started. Alright, well in this nugget on installation issues, we're going to start by talking about network installation. How do we install Linux over a network using the network file system, or FTP, or HTTP as our protocol? And then we're going to move on and talk about Kickstart, which is a very cool tool that automates the installation process. Okay, so if you need to install Linux on a bunch of machines that are basically identical, you're going to want to use Kickstart because it's going to wind up saving you a lot of time. So we'll talk about how to configure and then how to set up and use Kickstart. And then we'll talk about the bootloaders Grub and Lilo at the end there. Okay, so for network installations, this is a pretty detailed topic. Okay, so what I want to do first is just kind of give you an overview of what a network installation is and how it's going to work, and then we'll move out to the Linux screen and talk about how to do each of these things step by step in more detail. Okay, so first, before we talk about what I've written down here, let me just draw you a picture. Okay, here's the machine that we want to install Linux on. Let's call this the client machine. Okay, so typically what we did in the introductory Linux series was we took the Linux CDs, okay, and we stuck the CD into the machine and we turned on the machine. And the machine booted off of this CD. This was a bootable CD. Okay, so basically it booted up some minimal version of Linux. So then we could run the installation program and read the rest of the packages and the kernel and everything else off the CD, and then the client would have a full version of Linux on it. Okay, and it wasn't just one CD, maybe it was 2 CDs or 3 CDs depending on what version of Linux we were talking about. Okay, well now what we're going to do is, instead of taking that CD and sticking it into the client computer, we're not going to do that anymore. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to set up another computer over here that's already running Linux. Let's call that the server, and we're going to copy all that information from the CD onto the hard drive of this server. Okay, now these machines are hooked up over the network, and what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to boot up the client and then read all this information off of the hard disk on that server. Okay, so the method of protocol here that we're going to use to transfer this data from the server to the client could be the network file system, it could be FTP or HTTP. Probably the two most common ones are NFS and FTP. Okay, so that's what happens. All right. Now, what we have to do is we have to boot up this client machine with a minimal version of Linux, just like we did when we stuck the CD in. The first thing that happened was we booted up the client with a minimal version of Linux. Then we did the full installation. Well, we have to do the same thing again, and the way that we're going to do it now is we're going to take a floppy disk and stick that floppy disk into the client computer. That boot floppy that we stick in there has to have this file on it called bootnet.image. Okay, bootnet.image is on disk 1 of your installation media in the /images directory. Okay, so in /images is bootnet.image. There's other image files called boot.image. They're probably the two most common ones. But we need bootnet.image so that we can do a network installation. All right? So bootnet.image is on the floppy, we boot up the client in the minimal version of Linux, and then it prompts us, it says, okay, how do you want to install Linux? Before, when we stuck the CD in, this is where we would type Linux text, for instance. Okay, to do a text installation of Linux. Well, now what we're going to type is Linux ask method, and it's going to come along and say, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to do a network installation? That's going to be one of our choices. So we'll choose network installation, and then it's going to say, okay, where's this server out here? What protocol are you going to use? What directory on this server are you getting that information from? That sort of stuff is all going to be prompted for us. Okay, so we'll have to answer all those questions. Right? And that's how we're going to install Linux on this client machine. All the data is going to be transferred over the network. And this isn't the only computer on the network, right? There's all sorts of other computers on the network, and we can install Linux on any of these other computers that are hooked up to this server on the network. Okay, now what we have to be careful of is how do we set up this server? That's actually where probably the bulk of the work is. Okay, well first you have to make sure you have enough space on the server, and the way to estimate that is take 650 megabytes times the number of CDs that you have in your installation pack. Okay, so for 2 CDs you need 1300 megabytes or 1.3 gigabytes. Then we need to copy that data from the CD onto the server's hard drive. And then once we do that, we need to make sure that data that we just copied onto the hard drive is accessible remotely so that those other machines out on the network can actually read this data. Okay, so that's what we have to do to set up the server, and then you saw in the last picture what we're actually going to do in the installation process. We're going to boot up the client machine and so on. All right, so now let's move out to the Linux screen and look at this stuff in a little bit more detail. All right, well, the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to set up the server side of things. So we're going to assume that this machine nugget is going to the machine that I'm going to copy all the data from the CDs onto this machine, and this machine will be the server for that installation the way we just drew it up on the whiteboard. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do here is just become the root user because I'm going to do some things that only the root user can do. And the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to mount the CD to the mount CD-ROM directory. Okay, so it's saying it's write protected, it's mounting as read-only. Now a little message popped up there. Let me just close this graphical window of the directory that we just mounted. It says, do you wish to run auto run? We don't want to run auto run because auto run has to do with the installation process. Okay, so here is the stuff that we're going to copy over. Okay, you can just see it in graphical format here. Let's just take a little peek in the images folder. In that directory, you'll see bootnet.image. We're going to have to deal with that in a little bit when we make a boot floppy. But for right now, I'm just going to close this window, and I'm just going to actually do the copy over to some directory on my machine. Well, what I should make sure first is that I actually have enough space. Okay, so I'll do the df command with the -h option to see the space that's available on my machine. And you can see here in my SDA2 partition, my second partition on my first SCSI disk, I have 1.6 gigabytes available. Since I'm talking about Red Hat 8 here and it has 2 CDs, that's, you know, I told you the estimation is 650 megabytes per CD, so that would be like 1.3 gigabytes. All right, so that would use up pretty much all of my available space. If I wasn't using this machine for anything else, if I wasn't hosting user accounts or anything else on this machine, it's fine. It'll fit on there and I can do it. And for the illustration of this idea, you know, we'll just assume that I'm going to do it on this machine. Okay, so the way that I'm going to move this over is all the data is I'm going to use the copy -AV command. I'm going to say from mount CD-ROM to a directory on my machine. Actually, let me make that directory first. I'm going to make a directory and I'm going to call it Red Hat install, RH install. Okay, right at the top level. Okay, so if we go to the top level directory and do an ls, you'll see now there's a directory Red Hat install, and that's where we're going to copy to. So I'm going to say copy -AV from mount CD-ROM to RH install. Now the A command here is for archiving. That's so that you preserve all the permissions, the directory structure, it does everything recursively, and V is just verbose. Okay, so this is going to copy all the information from the CD to the RH install directory, and you have to do this for each CD. Okay, so the first CD is in the drive now. I'll do it. Then I would take it out, mount the CD. You know, I would unmount the CD, take it out, put the new one in, mount it, and do this all over again for each of the CDs. Okay, I'm not going to do this because it's very time consuming, and I'm actually not setting up the server to do this, so I just wanted to show you what you have to do to get this to work. So I'm just going to hit Control-C here. All right, so now once you copy over the data for each of the 2 disks, then what you need to do is make sure that it's accessible to everybody else on the network. So let's just assume that we're setting it up for an NFS install. That's probably the most common way to do it. So for a network file system install, what we have to do is go to the etc directory and edit the exports file. Okay, so we're going to edit the exports file. I'm going to use Emacs to do that. Let me just make this a full screen here so we can see. You can see the file's empty right now. I haven't set up any sharing of directories on my system. So what I'm going to do here is I specify the directory that I want to share, RH install. I say who can share it, who on the network is allowed to read this directory, and I'll just say star there. So everybody on the network is allowed to have access to this directory. And then in parentheses, you give the kind of permission that you want to give. I'm going to say RO for read only. I don't want anybody out on the network to be able to write and delete files in this directory. I want to set this up so that I can do installs from this directory for every machine on the network. I don't want to let anybody screw it up. So I'm saying everybody can read it, nobody can write it. Okay, so I would say Control-X, Control-C for the Emacs save, and you can see down at the bottom, I'll just hit Y there to save it. Okay, now the exports file has that has that entry in it, and now we can share this directory to all the other computers. Okay, so this is what you have to do on the server side of things. All right, now let's talk about making that boot floppy and actually doing the installation from that client machine. All right, well, the first step to make this boot floppy is, again, we need to mount the CD-ROM, and I'm going to say mount it from dev CD-ROM to the mount CD-ROM directory. Okay, and again, we're going to get that window to pop up with a graphical display of the files on there. I'm just going to close that. It asks if we want to run auto run again. We don't, so I'm going to click no there again. And now the CD-ROM's mounted. Okay, now what I want to do is copy from that images directory on that CD, and I want to copy that bootnet.image onto the floppy disk that I just put in my machine. Okay, now to do that I have to use I can't use the copy command, I need to use the DD command. The DD command is like a copy command, but it's a very sort of primitive one. It's kind of like a raw copy. And anytime you're doing a copy of like an image file, like that .img file, you need to use something like the DD command and not copy, because you're not really copying it to a file system. You're doing like a more primitive copy of just the underlying data onto the floppy disk. So the way that you specify this is you first specify an input file. So I'm going to say the input file is mount CD-ROM images bootnet.image, okay? And then you specify an output file, which is dev fd0. Okay, that's a 0, not an O. So that's my first floppy disk. Okay, so there I'm going to do this, I'm going to hit enter, and now the copying is taking place. This is actually going to take a couple minutes because floppy disks are so darn slow, and so I'm just going to pause the video and I'm going to come back to show you what the result of this is. Alright, well, that's all there is to it. There's the output of this command. It tells you how many records it read in, how many records it spit out to the floppy, and now the floppy disk has this bootnet.image on it. And now what we're going to do is go ahead and put that floppy disk into a new machine and look at how we would use, how we would do a network installation using this floppy disk. Alright, so let me walk you through some screenshots of what happens when you put in that boot image floppy that we just made, bootnet.image. You stick that in the computer and you turn it on. Then this is the first screen that you get where you have to do something. Okay, it comes up with this boot prompt down here, and this is where we would type like Linux text if we were doing a text mode install. But now what we would type is Linux ask method. Okay, now this is going to do the network install on this client machine. Alright, so once I hit enter there, then it says, you know, it's loading VM Linus, which is the kernel. It goes through some other ugly screens of all sorts of detailed information about what it's doing. And then it starts to ask questions about the installation itself. What language do you want to use during the installation? We're going to use English. What type of keyboard? We have a US keyboard. And then the important stuff is what type of media contains the packages to be installed. So let's first walk through an NFS image. Alright, I'll hit OK, and now it asks you for information about the client machine, the machine that you're installing Linux on. Alright, so if you're using the dynamic IP configuration stuff like DHCP, then you make sure that's starred. Otherwise, you would hit spacebar there to unstar that, and you'd fill in these four fields, the IP, the netmask, the gateway, and the name server for that client machine that you're installing Linux on. Okay, I'm using this, so I'm going to go forward there. And then it's asking you, once you give the client information, it's asking you for the server information. So what's the name of the server? What's the directory on that server where the client can get the installation files from? All right, so you either give an IP number or the name of the server, and you give that directory. Alright, so that's all you have to do to boot up over the network. That's easy, right? Let's look at, for FTP and HTTP, what else you would have to do. So for FTP, again, you choose FTP there. Again, you have to give information about the client machine, its network address, that sort of stuff. And then you have to give information about the server again. So you have to give the FTP site name and the directory on that site where the Red Hat installation files are contained. If you're using non-anonymous FTP, so you have to give an account name and a password, then you need to hit that, you need to star this and give a username and a password that you're going to use there. Okay, so we're not going to talk about how to set up the server side of FTP because I think it's sort of jumping ahead too much. So in this video, we're going to ignore that. If there's an FTP site out there that you want to install Linux from, all you need to know is the site name and the directory on that site, and it's probably set up to use anonymous FTP, so you would leave that unchecked. Okay, when we later in the series we'll talk about FTP and how to set up FTP servers and so on, and then I'll come back and flash back to this video and show you what you would have to do if you were setting up a network on your personal network so that other people could do FTP installs from that machine. All right, but right now I feel it's just jumping ahead too much. Okay, the same goes for HTTP. Okay, we're not going to talk about how to set up the web server to do that, but if there's a website out there that you want to install Linux from, this is the configuration screen you're going to get. Again, you have to give client information first, and then server information. What's the name of the website and what's the directory on that website that you're going to get the information from. Alright, so that's all there is to it for a network install. Once you've set up the server correctly, you've made the boot floppy correctly, then the actual installation, again, is just a piece of cake like it's always been. All right, well, now let's move on and talk about Kickstart, which is a very neat tool that Red Hat has that allows you to automate the installation process. So why do you want to do this? Well, if you're installing Linux on a bunch of basically identical machines, you're going to want to use Kickstart for two reasons. One is it's going to save you a whole lot of time. You're not going to have to sit around in front of each computer and answer a whole bunch of questions. The other reason is you're going to have the peace of mind to know that each installation that is done in an identical fashion. The same packages are installed, the same partitioning scheme is used, that sort of stuff. So when you go to do maintenance on the machines, you're going to know what the starting point is. Okay. Now, a single configuration file controls the whole Kickstart process. That configuration file is typically called ks.cfg for Kickstart configuration. Okay, and there's three ways to make one of these files. The first way is you take sample.ks, which is in the rhdocs directory on the documentation CDs, and you edit that file. And this is just like other Linux configuration files. It's just a plain old text file. So you take your favorite text editor and you tweak this sample file so that the installation is carried out just the way you want. All right, that's one way. Another way is you can use the anaconda-ks.config file, which is in the root user's home directory /root. Now, this configuration file is special because it mirrors the system installation on the system that it lives on. All right, so like if you want to, you don't want to take this sample KS file, for instance, and you just want to go ahead and do an installation off CDs and do it very carefully. All right, well, you do the installation off CDs, you do it carefully, you answer all the questions, you set everything up just the way you want, and then when you're done that installation, this configuration file is created automatically, and then if you want to duplicate this installation, you just make this your KS config file, okay? And this is set up so you can just mirror the installation that you just did. All right. A third way to make this configuration file is to use the graphical user interface called ksconfig, and that's in the /user/sbin directory. So we'll talk about how to use this GUI, and we'll look at these sample files in a couple minutes when we go out to the Linux screen. But first I want to just talk about some rules about editing these sample configuration files. Okay, first is you cannot change the order of the options in those files. You can tweak the values and do things a little different, but you cannot change the order of the options. And now, not all of the options are required in those configuration files, but if you leave out a required option, you're going to be prompted and the installation is going to stop. Okay, and wait for your answer. So this kind of defeats the purpose of Kickstart, right? The reason you're doing it is because you don't want to sit in front of the computer and answer a bunch of questions, all right? So you're going to be prompted. Now, if there is one required option out there that's going to change from system to system, then, maybe this is the only way to go. But no, just be aware that if you leave out a required option, it's going to stop the installation process and wait for your answer. All right. So once you've got the configuration file, either by modifying those samples or by using the graphical user interface, then you actually have to use Kickstart when you do in the installation when you boot up. Okay, so one way to use Kickstart is to copy this configuration file that you made over to a boot floppy. Then you boot off that boot floppy, and when you get to that boot prompt, you type Linux ks =floppy. This is probably the most common way to use Kickstart. All right, and then what's going to happen is the program's going to read the Kickstart configuration file, look at all the options, and go ahead and just do the whole installation. If this is set up correctly, this is the last thing you type. You don't have to answer any more questions. That's a very efficient use of your time, right? You just boot off the floppy and type that, and you're done. Now, another way to do it is you might have the KS configuration file on a network somewhere. And in that case, when you get to the boot prompt, you type Linux KS equals NFS : the IP address of the machine where the configuration file lives, and colon, and then the directory and the name of the file where it lives. Okay, so if this server out here is like an HTTP server, then you would start that with HTTP : instead of NFS : Okay, if it's an FTP server, it would start with FTP : and so on. Okay, so these are probably the two most common ways to use Kickstart. There's some other ways out there. You can consult the documentation if you think you have some other way that you'd like to do it, but these are probably the two most common ways. So now that we understand the basic process of Kickstart and how to use it, let's go back and look at those configuration files and how to use the GUI out on the Linux screen. Okay, well now let's look at these Kickstart configuration sample files, and I'm going to show you a resource where you can learn which of the options in the Kickstart configuration file are optional and which ones are required. Okay, so we're in the root user's home directory here, and let's just look at this Anaconda KS config file. Okay, so this is the one that mirrors the installation we did on this computer Nugget. Okay, so I'm going to hit enter here, and this is the first page of the Kickstart configuration file. And you can see it's just line after line. Basically think of it like a Linux command, and then the double dashes followed by some option, and then some qualifier for those options potentially. Okay, so that's kind of the way it's laid out. Each line takes care of some facet of the installation. Like the language is English US, the keyboard is US, the mouse is a generic PS2 mouse, and I've got the emulate 3 button qualifier there. Okay, and it just goes on and on. There's all sorts of stuff in here. The firewall, the authentication configuration. I have shadowed passwords and MD5 encryption. My time zone, where the location of the bootloader is. That sort of stuff is in here. Okay. Now, as you go down, here's partition information. Now, this hash sign or the sharp sign here in the front is means it's commented out. So this stuff is not active by default. Okay, so if you want this to be active, if you want this stuff to take effect, you have to, remove those pound signs, those sharp signs. Okay, and the reason that this is commented out is just because this is a pretty sensitive part of the installation, right? One thing to note here is that like I said before, if you're installing on a bunch of basically identical machines, that's when Kickstart really pays off. The machines don't have to be exactly identical. And one example where they don't have to be exactly identical is shown in this partition information. You can see here that there's a partition. It's mounted on /. Okay, that's where it's mounted in the files in the directory tree. The size of the partition is here, and then you can see there's a --" grow option on that partition. Now, what this means is the other partitions are fixed in size. Okay, this one has grow on it, but it has a max size of 512 for the swap partition. This one, though, has grow, and there's no max size. So the disk, there won't be like leftover space on the disk if you use this Kickstart file. If we uncomment this out, it's going to have 100 megabyte partition for /boot. It's going to have a maximum of 512 megabyte partition for the swap. For the swap file, and then it's going to have a partition that's as big as the rest of the disk for the other partition here. Okay, so that's a nice option. You don't have to have different partition information for all the different size disks out there, because all the computers that you're installing on might not be used for the exact same purpose, so they might not have the exact same size disks in them. Okay, so that's one nice part here. And then as we page down here, I'll hit the space bar and page down, you can see now it's just a list of packages. Okay, package after package after package that gets installed, and whatever packages you want to have installed on all the different systems should be listed in here. Okay, so that is what a Kickstart configuration file looks like. One last note here is there's a post section, and this is like a small little script that gets executed after the installation happens. Okay, so here the script is for a user add. So it added my user account, Perry. It changed my full name to Perry Fasano. It set my password up. Again, that's encrypted, so nobody can just look at this configuration file and steal my password. This is the kind of stuff that you probably won't have in your Kickstart configuration file if you're doing an install on a whole bunch of computers in a network, because your user authentication stuff is probably going to go on in a central location. You're going to use NIS or Kerberos or something like that, and have that do the authentication so that usernames and passwords are in one central location. You change your password on one computer in the network, it changes on all of them. We haven't talked about how to do that yet. Later on in this video series, we'll go over how to do that. But just take it for now that if you're doing this installation over a whole bunch of computers in the network, this is probably the kind of thing you would delete out of your sample Kickstart configuration file. Okay, so that's what a Kickstart configuration file looks like. You can go in there and edit it with a text editor and tweak it so that it's just the way you want. Remember, though, you can't change the order of options, and leaving out required options means you're going to get prompted, and that and the installation will not go on until you answer those questions that you're prompted for. So what I want to do now is just open up a web browser window, open up a Mozilla window, and look at show you how to determine which options are required and which ones aren't. So I'm going to go to the redhat.com internet site, and here I'm going to look up Kickstart options, and then I'm also going to put my version number here, 8.0. Okay, so that'll you always have to make sure that you're looking at the right version of Linux when you do a search on this website, because they have documentation for all the versions of Linux that's ever existed. So I'll do the search, and then let's look at our results here, and you can see Kickstart options for Red Hat Linux 8.0. That looks like what I want. I'm going to click on that. And then here, you can see how small this little bar is. This is a really long web page. Okay, these are all the different options, and then the qualifiers for each of those options. So you can see this option auto step is optional. Okay, the option auth or auth config is required. So if you leave this out, you're going to get prompted for information. Okay, and you're going to have to supply it before the installation completes. And then you can see all the different qualifiers for the auth option. Okay, and if we just go down this web page here, I'm just going to scroll down kind of quickly here, you can just see there's like 30, 40 options for auth. Okay, and then there's bootloader. Okay, there's another required option, and then there's a bunch of different qualifiers for it. Okay, clear part has to do with removing partitions from the system. Okay, again, device is optional. And we can just go on and on here. But at least here you can see which options are optional and which options are required, and that way you'll know when you're creating your Kickstart configuration file if you're leaving something out that's required. Okay, you should always check to make sure that you're not, if you can help it. Okay, so this is a resource where you can learn this kind of stuff, which options are required and which options are optional. And then what I want to do now is look at the ksconfig GUI to configure this stuff, because a lot of people just find looking at this, these sample configuration files and editing them a little bit cumbersome, a little bit tedious, and the Kickstart configuration GUI is much nicer to use. Okay, so let's look at that now. So you can invoke the graphical user interface Kickstart configurator either by typing ksconfig at the command line, or you can go in the menus under System Tools, Kickstart. Now in there, you'll see this is the graphical user interface. Remember, Kickstart ksconfig is in the /user/sbin directory, so if you're typing it at the command line, make sure that directory is in your path. Okay, so there's a bunch of headings off here on the left, and then for each of these headings there's going to be a separate screen that we have to fill out information for. So this is the basic configuration screen. What language are you using? What mouse? What's your time zone? What's the root password? Should you encrypt the root password? Language support. Do you want to reboot after installation? All those sorts of things are under basic configuration. The installation method is another screen. Are we doing a new installation, or are we upgrading an existing one? Are we installing from a CD, NFS, FTP, HTTP? Are we using a hard drive installation? We didn't talk about this installation. This basically just involves copying the ISO image off the CD to a hard drive partition if you've already formatted the hard drive, and then you can do the installation right off the hard drive. I don't find this to be very useful. I just skipped over it. Okay, bootloader options, okay, for Grub and Lilo, which we're going to talk about next when we wrap up. Partition information. What do you want to do for partitions? Do you want to remove existing partitions, preserve them, and so on? Okay, network configuration. Are we using DHCP, or if we're using a static IP, then we have to fill out this field. You can see it's sort of lit up there. Okay, authentication. Are we using shadow passwords, MD5? Are we using NIS? Are we using Kerberos? Hesiod is something to do with Hesiod has something to do with Kerberos. We'll talk about that in a later video, how to configure all that. Firewall configuration. Is it high? Should we use default firewall rules? Are we going to customize it? And then we would have to go down what kind of traffic we would allow to come through the firewall. Okay, X configuration. Do you want to configure this? Do you want to put in a video card and a monitor? That sort of stuff. Package selection, pre-installation script and a post-installation script. We saw a post-installation script in the Anaconda sample configuration file. That's where it added the user Perry and so on, and added the password for Perry. There's also a place where you can do a pre-installation script. Okay, warning here is an error in this script might cause your Kickstart installation to fail. Do not include the percentage pre command at the beginning. They'll put that in for you when you're done. You should just type the commands in the script as you want them executed before you do an installation. Okay, so this is how the Kickstart configurator works. Again, you can look up on our website there for information about all the different options and how you should set things, and information about KSConfig is also on this website if you search for that. Okay, so that's Kickstart. That's how it works. That's how you configure the configuration file for it. And now let's move on and just do a little discussion of Grub and Lilo. Well, our last topic for this nugget, I just wanted to give a brief discussion of bootloaders because we're going to need this information a little bit more as we go on. We already talked briefly about bootloaders when we were talking about dual boot installations, and we said that Grub and Lilo can both support booting multiple operating systems. All right. Remember, Grub stands for the Grand Unified Bootloader, and Lilo is the Linux loader. I just want to give you a couple, bits and pieces of information here, and later as we go on throughout this video series, we might need more tidbits about Grub and Lilo, and I'll give you those as we need them. Okay, so first let's just look at some screenshots of Grub, and I'm going to show you how to do a couple useful things in there, and then we'll move on and talk about Lilo. Well, one of the most useful things to understand about either bootloader, any bootloader at all, is how to boot into an alternate run level. We talked about run levels in the introductory series, and a run level defines what services start automatically. Okay, and like a run level 5 or something, X Windows starts, and run level 3, X Windows doesn't start. And so if you need to debug X Windows, it's not starting up, you're not getting into your system to do anything, then you'll have to go into Grub and boot to an alternate run level, like run level 3, where X Windows doesn't start, and then you can mess with the configuration files for X Windows. We're going to be talking about X Windows here in a couple videos, so this is a good preface to that discussion. Okay, so we want to use Grub to boot into an alternate run level. How do we do that? Well, we have to use the commands here. We have to edit the booting commands. All right, you can see they list the commands that you have at your disposal down here. You can use up and down keys to boot various operating systems in this list. If we had a dual boot operating system, there would be a DOS or a Windows element in here, but we don't, so we only have one thing in the list. E to edit the commands before you boot, A to modify kernel arguments, and C you get a command line. Okay, so we want to press E here, and when we press E, I'll go to the next screenshot, and now this is a list of the commands in the boot sequence. Okay, we want to alter this kernel command here. We want to boot it into a different run level, so that's the command that we need to boot, or that we need to change. Okay, so we would hit the down arrow key to go to that command, and then we would hit E again to edit that selected command. Okay, now when we hit E again, you'll see there's the command line, command name there, and we can edit it on this line just like we can edit a command in the bash shell. Okay, we can use the arrow keys and various things to edit this command. All we need to do to boot into a different run level is add something on the end here, a number that is that run level, a space after this slash, and then the run level. Okay, so if I want to boot into single user mode, I would type 1 there. I can actually type the word single as well. Okay, now this boots into a single user mode. When do you use that? Well, you use that if you're doing backups or some kind of upgrade so that nobody else can log onto the system while you're doing what you're doing, because them logging onto the system might actually mess up your work. Okay, so that's how we would boot into a single user mode in Grub, and I think that's just one of the most useful things that we need to know about it right now. Certainly that's a good preface to our X Windows discussion that's coming up in a couple of videos here. So for Lilo to boot into an alternate run level, it's actually a little bit easier. You'll get the boot prompt like we've seen when we're booting off a floppy disk or various things like that. That screen that you see right there is actually a Lilo screen. And when you see that boot prompt, to boot into an alternate run level, you would just type something like vmlinus3 to boot into run level 3, or vmlinus1 to boot into run level 1, or single user mode. You can actually type vmlinus single there as well to boot into single user mode. Okay, so Lilo is actually a little bit easier to boot into an alternate run level. You don't have to go through as many steps. You just have to type a different command at the boot prompt. Once you're done in single user mode, you can type reboot, and it will boot back to the default run level so that things like X Windows and various things start. Okay, so so that's how you do it in Lilo. Note that Lilo will be removed from Red Hat Linux eventually. They've been saying this for a while. It's still there. It's still part of the system, but it will be removed eventually, and that's probably a good reason to use Grub, just because it's going to be around for longer in Red Hat. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on installation issues. We continued our discussion of installation issues by first talking about network installs. So we learned how to install Linux over the network, whether that network's a local network with running like networked file system, or FTP or HTTP. And then we talked about Kickstart, which is a program that automates installation so that you don't have to go around and do an install on multiple computers. You can set up a configuration file and run the Kickstart program, and then that will do the install on all the computers in an identical fashion. And we wrapped up our discussion with Grub and Lilo, just a brief discussion of Grub and Lilo, just to preface what's to come in the next few videos. We're going to need to know a few things about Grub and Lilo. All right, well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.